Hello and welcome to another installment of virtual programming from the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. This slide presentation was slated to be given during our annual Whales and Whaling Symposium that was scheduled for April 3rd. But since we couldn't invite you to the museum, we figured we'd make this available on the internet for you. The title of this lecture is The Historic Whale Fishery of Shackleford Banks. What I will try to do is teach you a little bit about the historic whale hunting that took place off of North Carolina and focus specifically on the activities that were taking place on Shackleford Banks. This map shows the locations where shore-based whaling was taking place along North Carolina's coast. Those are represented by the yellow dots. The green dots represent where whale processing occurred. This is where the whale was brought ashore and blubber was removed and bone or baleen was taken from the whale. Now the red dots indicate where pelagic whale ships were actively hunting whales in the open ocean. So these ships were mostly based out of Massachusetts and the New England region. So it's possible that shore-based whaling activities were taking place on North Carolina's coast as early as the mid-1600s. This was a record from the assistant governor of the region who granted a commercial whaling license to several men from New England. Explorer John Lawson noted in the early 1700s that whales are very numerous on the coast of North Carolina, but none being struck or killed with a harpoon as they are to the northward. So this would lead some people to believe that the only whales that may have been processed along our coast at that time were drift whales, whales that had died at sea for some reason or another and washed up on the beach. By 1710, the whale fishery along our coast was still open to the people of the region. There were instructions from Governor Eden to procure 1/10 of the product as owed to the government. This is a copy of a license that was issued to Samuel Chadwick to allow him to take whales off of the coast, and that was issued in 1726. In the bottom left of this slide, you can see some reports from whaling crews around that time period. So this portion of a 1700 map shows the Carteret region with Cape Lookout and Bug Banks. The red circle indicates where New Englander Samuel Chadwick moved to in the area. It's more than likely if he were to practice whaling, he would have gone over to the banks. So this is a portion of a 1733 map by Edward Moseley. He was the Surveyor General of the colony of North Carolina, and he put on his map several little images of whales out in the water and even a small whaleboat with what looks like someone with a harpoon on the bow of it going after one of these whales. Whalers in North Carolina, whether the shore-based whalers or the pelagic whalers that were operating off the coast, may have obtained nearly 4,200 barrels of whale oil over the 15-year period from 1715 to 1730. It could be estimated that an average of 6 to 9 whales were taken per year in North Carolina, and those were probably shore-based activities. These records are unfortunately scarce, and they do not know whether the whalers resided in North Carolina or were from up north and taking whales off of the North Carolina coast. In 1757, 2 tracts of land were sold from John Shackleford to Joseph Morse and Edward Fuller. They were both involved in whale fishing. The land was somewhere on the beach between Beaufort Inlet and Cape Lookout. You can see it on this 1738 map where I highlighted that stretch of coastline in red. So prior to the Revolution, the North Carolina whale fishery remained active. In 1754, Governor Arthur Dobbs reported that the harbor at Cape Lookout was being used by whale fishers during the winter and noted that whale fishers from the northward have a considerable fishery there. So what he was referring to was the region between Cape Lookout and Beaufort Inlet. During this time period, passing vessels noted whalers' huts located on the stretch of coast. Now, this image is from a later engraving that was from the Bulletin of the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, and it depicted what a fish camp might look like on Shackleford Banks. But these fishing crews were more than likely the same people that were actively engaged in hunting whales off of the coast as well. One account from 1762 noted, "We saw on it the bones of whales which had been caught in the neighborhood and cut up there." In 1764, someone in a survey vessel noted whalers' huts along that stretch of the banks. And in 1765, a French traveler who was passing by and visited the Cape Lookout area observed that there were some whale fishers' tents in the region. This is a survey chart that was created by Captain Jacob Lobb in 1764. He noted several landmarks on the chart, one of which located at the letter I near the top of the picture here was whalers' huts. So to understand more about the whaling activities that were taking place along Shackleford Banks, we probably need to look at what was going on the island in general, as far as who was living on the island or how many people were out there. Um, it's believed that some type of permanent settlement existed on Shackleford Banks by 1723. There was an area known as Lookout Woods, but would later be called Diamond City around 1885, which seemed to be the largest center of population along the island. Now, the government census counts list no more than 300 people living on Shackleford Banks around 1850, but increasing to at least 500 by 1880. Oddly enough, by 1902, just a short 20 some years later, it's believed that no permanent residents lived on the island. They had left to various nearby places, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in following slides. So this is a survey chart that was completed in June of 1888, and it shows the Cape Lookout region and Shackleford Banks extending to the west. Notice that at this time, the island of Shackleford Banks is still connected to South Core Banks or Cape Lookout. You can see on the right side portion of this image, the Cape Lookout Lighthouse is marked with a small dot and kind of a sunburst symbol around it. But I put this up here because I wanted to show you um, on this map, they actually marked structures. Now, some of these may have just been some of those fish camps. Some of them may have been a little more permanent than that. Um, if you look along the north side of Shackleford Banks, which would be what some people may call the sound side um, of the island along the marsh edges, uh, you'll see many little black dots. Those more than likely represent houses that were on the island at this time in 1888. There are a few structures that are out on the beach side, um, but what was interesting to me was that those dots on the map um, along the sound side of the island represented houses where people were living. So as we move along here, kind of through time, we've established that there were residents out on Shackleford Banks, but throughout the history of the island and the settlements that existed out there, there were other things that took place. There were other things that were going on besides looking for whales. During the American Revolution, whaling activities along the coast they may have slowed down some due to trade embargoes, uh, blockades, or destructions of ships that were occurred up and down the eastern seaboard. Um, in 1775, the British Parliament decreed that no whaling shall occur by the colonists in North America. So they basically said you cannot go out and do that. Um, there was a interesting incident that took place in December of 1776 within the local militia, where an enlisted man, David Wade, was arrested for desertion from Captain Enoch Ward's Corps Sound Company. So these were the militiamen that were there from the region that were going to potentially be fighting the British during the American Revolution. But David Wade deserts the Corps Sound Company, and the reason was, and this was a quote, was to go a whaling along the banks with Captain Pinkham. So he got in trouble because he left his duties and went to go whaling. This is a drawing of the Cape Lookout area, um, and it shows some of the structures that existed out on Shackleford Banks. Um, you see the Davis House Village, and that's probably referring to Lookout Woods Village, which would become Diamond City. And then there's a structure to the west along Shackleford Banks of the village, and that was actually a established fort, Fort Hancock. And the next slide shows a more detailed depiction of what that looked like. In December of 1778, the North Carolina Council agreed to allow men from the banks exemption from military draft. So it could have been that local residents of the banks along the coast that were these folks that were engaged in fishing and hunting for whales um, said, "Hey, we're doing important work here. I know we know that there's a big war going on, but people need to eat, and we are going to feed them, and we need to do that. We can't be off fighting and participating in military activities when people are starving. So maybe that's the reason why they gave them that exemption." So here's a drawing of what Fort Hancock on Shackleford Banks might have looked like. It was just an earthen structure, a small outpost, if you will. And it only was occupied for a couple of years during part of the war. So about that time, whale products were still originating from the area. So this was stuff that was coming from whales harvested off of the coast here. And what I did in this slide was put together um, some of the records on uh, the dates and vessels that were shipping out whale product, what the product was or the cargo, um, the captain, and where the destination was. So you can look at the time period here, uh, just a small slice of the history, 1785 to 1789, and we see ships leaving out of the port of Beaufort carrying whalebone and whale oil, and their destinations um, all up and down the seaboard, even overseas to England, the West Indies, the Guadalupe Islands. Um, Now, most of the product that was coming off of Shackleford Banks was more than likely being shipped over to Beaufort. It was put up for auction. Um, some maybe went to Morehead City and some to New Bern. Um, but there were some of it may have possibly been um, headed out to faraway destinations. For the time period following the American Revolution, it's more than likely that whales were still being pursued and harvested along our coast, but just not in great numbers. There was a more active fishery that was taking place. From the period of 1810 to 1860, the bottlenose dolphin fishery at Beaufort was conducted every year by 3 different crews of men. It is noted as being more active than the whale fishery, with men coming from Beaufort to participate in the harvest along with men from Cape Lookout. And these typically were not the same people that were involved in hunting the larger marine mammals, the whales, off of our coast. For some reason or another, you seem to have groups or crews of men that focused on the bottlenose dolphin fishery, and then separate crews that just focused in harvesting whales. Now, I put this image in here because this was a pretty big operation. There were several that were taking place. Some big ones were up along Hatteras as well. Um, but in an average year, it was estimated that they might catch 400 to 500 dolphin. Um, an average year for whaling activities along the coast was maybe 4 to 6 whales. Um, Now, the whales were a lot bigger, uh, but part of the reason that they harvested more dolphins was because they tended to maybe travel together in larger groups in pods, and they were easy to target a bunch of dolphins at one time. But nonetheless, this was an active fishery along our coast, and maybe even more so than. So during the period of the middle 1800s, we of course had a major conflict going on within the country. The whale fishery at the time of the Civil War probably slowed down again, just as it did in the American Revolution. Um, but this was probably more of an issue for the pelagic whalers that were um, out in the offshore waters of the ocean that were encountering enemy vessels and raiders that were wreaking havoc on different industries in order in an effort um, to win the war. Um, Interestingly, it was recorded that the residents of Shackleford Banks reportedly displayed, and this is a quote, a remarkable indifference to political causes espoused by either the North or the South, end quote. Um, so the folks there on Shackleford um, probably just carried on with their everyday practices of fishing or whaling. If we remember during the uh, latter part of the American Revolution, they were basically given exemption from military service. So this may have just continued on up through the 1800s and into the Civil War. Um, Now, for the time period of 1850 to 1890, um, the whaling activity along Shackleford Banks was documented fairly well. So this may make it seem like it was a very active time for hunting whales, but it's more than likely just because someone was out there actually taking notes and writing down and observing the things that were happening, whereas that didn't take place before. So it might make it seem like it was more active, but uh, more than likely it was just because someone was finally paying attention to it. So to get into the specifics of Shackleford Island settlements at the time period, I came across this map that was originally created by Connie Mason, and it depicted communities that were on Shackleford Banks in the late 1800s. Um, Now, I added to Connie's original map. I put some other place names on there, like Beaufort and Fort Macon, just to kind of point them out so you can see the surrounding area of Shackleford Banks. Uh, and I also actually added some other um, community names uh, on the island as I learned them as I went along. Um, the late Ira Lewis of Harker's Island, he shared some names with me and locations. I met with him uh, years ago. Um, Now there's some places that I have names to, but I don't have locations. Just doing some reading through some of David Stick's uh, literature. He mentions other places like Whalers Camp, Middle Whalers Camp, and Whalers Camp Point. So I don't know exactly where those were, but maybe someday I'll find some more information that will shed some light on those locations. But you can see from west to east, you'll notice that I have Beaufort Inlet labeled as Topsail Inlet. That's what it would have been at the time. But we see um, Whale Creek is marked on the map, Whale Hill, Lookout Dune. Um, so all these names are kind of referring uh, places related uh, to whaling, more than likely. Whale Hill and Lookout Dune were places where someone probably sat up on a high dune and watched for whales passing along the coast. Whale Creek could have been a spot where um, whale products were loaded onto a shallow draft um, sailboat and taken over to Beaufort or to Harker's Island or Morehead City. So it's noted that the particular species of whale that was pursued off of this stretch of coastline was the right whale. Um, they were the primary targets for shore-based whalers of Shackleford Banks. Other whales were listed in the area, but seldom chased. Now, most of the records coming from the late 19th century indicate that the right whale was the whale that was targeted. Um, I have some notes here uh, on maybe why that was. If they came across other whales, and they didn't deem them worth their while, maybe that's why they didn't uh, bring in any humpback whales uh, or any smaller species like pygmy sperm whales or pilot whales or anything. So the right whale was, it swam slowly. It was an easy target. Its carcass floated after it was killed. Um, that made it easier to bring to shore. It also yielded the most whale oil, and maybe that's why the carcass floated so well compared to others. Um, and the right whales could be spotted from lookout points atop a sand dune as they migrated along the coastline. So they came in close enough to shore that someone could stand on a high dune and see them as they were passing along the beach. This is a picture of Elliot Ladd Coos when he was a medical cadet in Washington in 1863. Now, I put his picture in here because he was stationed at Fort Macon from 1869 to through 1870, and because he was very interested in the natural surroundings, of the coastal environment, he went out and spent time taking notes, in particular, taking notes about the dolphin seining and the whales being harvested in the area. So he actually went over to Shackleford Banks, and some of his records he has written down, and this is from his notes here. Remains of whales are strewn abundantly along the beach, and that's referring to Shackleford. He noted that the whales were being harvested on occasion in the spring, maybe 2 to 3 uh, every year. Um, he noted that the locals referred to the whales as the right whale, which we just talked about. Um, Sometimes they called him a scrag and humpback. So they may have been getting some of those humpback whales, as Elliot noted. Um, but it also could have just been that was a nickname that the whalers gave to the right whale. So we're not really 100% sure. Now, the scrag whale may refer to the gray whale species, but there's some indication that it might just have been referring to right whales that did not have a lot of blubber, um, thin-skinned right whales, if you will. Um, but there's no records of actual humpback whales or gray whales being harvested by the whalers of Shackleford Banks. It didn't mean it didn't happen, but um, you know, the right whales seem to be the ones that are moving in close enough to shore that they would be the ones that were targeted. Now, this fellow here is the state geologist uh, for North Carolina, and that was um, the 1870s to the 1880s. Uh, and he noted that sperm whales were also killed along the coast, with total averages of all whales being caught was 5 to 6 per season. Um, Now, it's more than likely that if a sperm whale was processed along Shackleford Banks, it was because it drifted up dead, not that it was actually pursued. Um, they they were could be much larger whales. Um, some some people have accounts that say that whalers, shore-based whalers, were afraid to go after sperm whales. Um, Maybe because they thrashed about more in the water after being harpooned. Um, but when you think about sperm whale activity off of our coast, they're typically much farther offshore because they're living and surviving in much deeper water where they have to find their food. Um, so that's probably why they would not have been harvesting a sperm whale. This is an article that I came across, and it's from 1876, and it was interesting because it talks about a particular whale skeleton that was brought from the coast and taken to the State Museum in Raleigh, which did exist at that time. It's now known as the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. But if you read through the article here, you can see that um, that Professor Kerr received the most valuable addition to the State Museum, the skeleton of a large whale which was captured off the coast at Beaufort. And it goes into some of the particulars about um, how big the whale was and how much oil and baleen it produced. So let's take a look at the actual act of shore-based whaling itself in the late 19th century along Shackleford Banks. So the season typically occurred from mid to late December through early May. There may have been a total of 2 or 3 camps each year and 18 men in each camp. So in one camp, you could have 3 boat crews. There's typically 6 men into a boat. Um, I've mentioned some numbers about average catch per year, maybe 4 whales. So it's not a lot of whales, but this was a way to supplement the local inhabitants' income to get a whale, because anywhere from 15 to 4,500 gallons of oil could come out of a whale. 500 to 800 some pounds of baleen, which then they could sell. So, what type of boat were these shore-based whalers using? This is a photograph of a boat builder that was born and raised on Shackleford Banks. His name is Divine Guthrie. Uh, he would have been building the boats that were used by the fishermen that were going after the whales. We call it a pilot boat. Some people call it a whale boat. Some people call it a surf boat because it was launched directly from the beach into the surf. It's a lap strake design. Um, the strakes that run down the side of the boat um, are made of 3/4 inch juniper. Uh, the style or the design can be dated to the mid 1300s and was also used by Basque shore whalers. Um, the boat might have been 20 to 25 feet long, and it was high pointed at the bow and the stern. It was basically double ended. Um, the front looked the same as the back. Um, so we talked about how someone might be sitting up on the dune and looking for a whale to come by. They would maybe yell out, "Whale sighted! Call all hands, make ready," and then the fishermen pick up the boat, they carry it down to the surf and push it out into the waves. And this is from a map that I showed earlier in the presentation, the 1733 Edward Moseley map. Um, but now we've got the pilot boat pursuing the whale. The harpooner is on the bow and he's getting ready to uh, throw towards the whale. There eventually were other implements that were used, uh, including the exploding lance gun. So this particular armament fired a basically a small bomb that went into the whale and exploded, hopefully killing the whale, so they didn't have to chase it as far. Um, just throwing one harpoon into a whale doesn't do the trick. That uh, with a line secured to it and a large block of wood could slow the whale down and tire them out, and eventually the whalers could catch up to them. But this weapon could maybe finish the whale off with a couple of shots. So it wasn't reported that any of these showed up in the North Carolina area until at least after the Civil War, and some say that it was seldom used at all and not until the early 20th century. The two guns were documented from Shackleford Banks. They were single barrel muzzle loaded weapons, and the explosive bombs were about 1 inch in diameter and 16 to 18 inches long. The line that you see secured to the stock of the gun was uh, attached to the boat on the other end, because if the recoil sent the gunner overboard, at least the gun could be retrieved and not sink to the bottom. So this particular fella is Herbert Hutchinson Brimley, English born, but moved to America, and he became the curator of the State Museum in Raleigh. That's the Museum of Natural Sciences. Um, he was a taxidermist, but he had interest in all sorts of things. And because you couldn't really taxidermy a whale, he at least had interest in the bones from the whale to put together more displays at the museum. So the following slides that you're about to see are images that were done by Frank Green, who accompanied Herbert Brimley on an expedition to Shackleford Banks in 1894. Now, Brimley provided some of the most detailed accounts of shore whaling on the North Carolina coast from that experience. And the images that came out of it kind of help describe the activity itself. So in this particular one, you see the small pilot boat or surf boat that the whalers would have used launching off the beach. They pursued a whale, they harpooned it. After the whale died, they were able to secure a line to it and tow it back to shore. And that's what you see in the main image of this picture is a right whale that has been uh, pulled up to the beach during the high tide. They put an anchor on it because they didn't want any later high tides to wash the whale back away. And then once the whale was up on the beach, the processing could take place. So this was referred to as the cutting in of the whale. And it could take days, it could take a week. You could imagine that it would get pretty stinky, but the large pieces of whale blubber were cut off and carried over to the tripods. You can see on the right hand side of this picture, two of the men have a large piece of blubber that has been cut from the carcass of the whale, and they are going to carry it over to somewhere where they have a fire going and a large black pot or kettle. They will chop up the whale blubber into smaller pieces. You can see the big stacks of whale blubber on the left, and then the gentleman that you see there on the left cutting up that blubber into smaller pieces, and then they're going to be putting it into the pots where it'll get boiled down and the oil will come out of the blubber, be skimmed off into barrels, which you see in the background. Somebody is getting the barrels ready, and then those barrels of the oil would finally be shipped over to Beaufort and maybe auctioned off to the highest bidder, or potentially bought and shipped anywhere along the coast or overseas. Now, there was a unique tradition that took place on Shackleford Banks, and that was any time that a whale was caught, it was eventually given a name. Um, we don't particularly know why this became a tradition, but when you think about it, maybe it was because the whales were valued so much and they brought uh, needed income to the residents of the island. Or maybe it was because it required so much effort and time that they felt they should at least name the whale that they had just um, spent all all that energy pursuing and processing, um, or maybe because it just didn't happen that often. And when talking about how less than a half a dozen whales were taken every year, so it was kind of a special occasion maybe. But these are some of the names that you see here on this slide of whales that were harvested along Shackleford Banks. And they each have a reason why they were called that particular name. Little children whale, for example, was a whale that apparently was pursued and harvested by the young boys of the island. It was said that that most of the men were off busy doing something else. Um, could have been that they were busy fishing, and the boys saw the whale and went after it and got it. And some of the names were just named for people that were involved in the act of harpooning the whale. Um, One was named after an earlier president, George Washington whale. The Cold Sunday whale was probably a whale that was taken on a Sunday that happened to be very cold. Now, I marked a couple of whales whose skeletons ended up at two different locations. I talked about a whale skeleton going to the State Museum in Raleigh. That whale was named the Mayflower whale. And then uh, I haven't talked about the second one yet, and that's the Mullet Pond whale. And that one was actually taken in 1898 in interestingly enough, it ended up at the Museum of Natural History at the University of Iowa. And that's kind of really a whole nother story in itself. But I'm going to talk about those two whales uh, in just a second because I want to talk about the people that were involved in harvesting the whales. So this is one of the gentlemen. His name is Josephus Willis. He was also born and raised on Shackleford Banks. Um, he uh, reported that he helped kill 52 whales over his lifetime, and he was the captain of the Red Oar crew. I still haven't figured out exactly what that means because um, some accounts say that it was uh, just merely the fact that the oars that they used on their boat were painted red, but for some reason I feel like maybe it was because his crew was made up of his five sons, and maybe they call it the Red Oar crew because red being the color of blood, uh, and they all shared the same blood since they were family. Maybe that's why, but I'm not exactly sure. But Josephus Willis was involved in the harvesting of the Mayflower whale, the one that ended up in the museum at Raleigh. Um, so there were other crews that pursued the whale. Reuben Willis, L.C. Guthrie, and W.C. Guthrie, James Lewis, and Samuel Windsor. They all had a boat crew that pursued the Mayflower whale from Shackleford Banks, but it was finally killed about 8 miles off of the beach. And Reuben Willis and his crew were the first to harpoon the whale, but they capsized. Um, the whale was named because it was the month of May when it was taken, and the pattern on the lower side of the whale looked like a flower. But some people say it was called the Mayflower whale because they had to row so far out to chase the whale. When they were coming back to the beach, they felt like they were the Mayflower on its voyage across the ocean. Um, but 8 miles is, I guess, it seems like a lot in a rowboat. Um, this picture is of Tyree Moore and his wife Marie. Tyree was born on Shackleford Banks in 1829. His father, Samuel Moore, was also a whaler. Tyree was reported as purchasing the first whale gun to be used in North Carolina. They say that he bought this on a trip to Baltimore, Maryland. Now, Tyree's crew pursued uh, the Mullet Pond whale, um, and they would have been the ones that brought that back to the beach, possibly to the general vicinity of the Mullet Pond, which you might remember from that map of Shackleford Banks that had the place names on it. So, what happened to the whaling activities of Shackleford Banks? Obviously, whaling does not take place out there today. Whales are protected animals. Um, but there were certain events that led up to this change and the end of the particular whale fishery off of this island. Um, it could have been that the decline of the whale population made it harder for the fishermen to find any whales. We know that the New England whale ships um, had gotten pretty good at going out, finding whales, and killing lots of them. Whales can only reproduce but so fast. Maybe they weren't. Maybe there weren't enough whales being born to keep up with the demand for the products of the oil and the baleen. But it's possible that um, because of a series of storms that occurred and caused the settlements of Shackleford Banks to disband, caused the residents to pack up and leave. Maybe that had played a part in the whaling not happening out there, but we don't think that that is particularly a cause. Even after these storms that occurred along the coast, and even though people may not have had permanent residents out there, the fishermen were still coming back to engage in their activities along Shackleford Banks. Just because they didn't live on the island anymore didn't mean they couldn't come back to it. And if they needed to still make a living and still harvest fish, they would have to come back to the island. Um, so some people think that um, these factors might have led to the demise in the whaling industry along this stretch of coastline. March 16th, 1916 is supposedly the date that the last whale was taken by Shackleford Banks crews, and it was pursued by two crews, one under Captain Charlie Rose and the other under Captain John Rose. They take a right whale in the shallow waters near Cape Lookout. Um, they say that the last whale crew of the area disbanded when a accidental fire destroyed some of their camps and all of their gear the following year in 1917. Um, so one of the other things that probably led to the end of the industry was that um, whale products, the oil that was used for lighting and lubrication and mechanical equipment, and the baleen products that were used were no longer in demand because there was a new item on the market. You know, oil, the refining of oil that had been mined and taken from the ground quickly replaced the need for using whale oil as an illuminant. Um, even products were coming out that replaced the need for um, the whale baleen and bone. So all these reasons, factored in with the local environmental uh, um, events, uh, caused basically this industry to eventually disappear. This was an image of maybe the last surviving Shackleford Banks whaleboat, and the picture I believe was actually taken over in Morehead City, but this was many years ago. The boat belonged to Captain John Lewis, and it would have been a boat like this that they would have gone out to pursue those whales. Um, so I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. These are some of the resources that I use to get some of the information um, for this slideshow. Uh, Stay tuned for more online educational programming from the museum as we go through this interesting time in history. Um, Thank you, and hope that you have a good day.